Lucy Kessler. She's a manager at the Rocky Mountain Institute and co-lead on steel at RMI's Center for Climate Aligned Finance. Lucy has worked on a range of projects from advancing access to climate finance in developing countries to identifying opportunities for the financial sector to align global capital flows with their climate targets. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rob. And thanks, Peter, for having me. So while you might be aware of the massive footprint of steel on modern civilization, found in everything from cars to skyscrapers and refrigerators to wind turbines, you're probably unaware that this metal has a tremendous carbon footprint as well. So the steel sector's carbon emissions accounts for about 8% of the world's total emissions, which is equivalent to the annual emissions of India. To put this in perspective, if the steel sector were a country, it'd be the third largest emitter on the planet. Not only that, but due to economic growth and projected demand, emissions from the steel sector are estimated to consume between 10 to 20% of the world's remaining 1.5 degree carbon budget. So when we think about how much we have left to emit to achieve these net zero goals, it's estimated that steel could consume about 10 to 20% of that. So today I'm going to talk about how finance and a bit of Greek mythology can be used to decarbonize this particularly hard to abate sector. So why is steel so hard to decarbonize? One of the reasons is that 70% of steel production relies on coal via the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace technology. And what this does is it involves heating coal down to its elemental state to remove the oxygen from iron ore and reduce it into steel. And as a result, for every ton of steel that's produced, there's about 1.8 tons of carbon dioxide that's emitted. So on average, it produces more carbon dioxide by weight than the product itself. This hard to abate sector faces several challenges, but there's three primary challenges I see to its decarbonization. One is there are limited alternatives. So the technology to produce zero carbon steel is not yet available at scale. It includes using hydrogen instead of something like coal, or perhaps carbon capture and sequestration. And steel is a commodity. A lot of steel producers face thin margins. There's steep competition. So this can make investing in alternative technologies really cost prohibitive for a lot of companies. Second, there's currently no established market for green steel. So although there's work that's currently being done to create a green steel certification, there's no way for the consumer to choose green steel like they could choose organics or choose an electric vehicle. So there's no way to really differentiate between low carbon steel in the market from higher carbon alternatives. Third, production facilities are long lived. There's about 40-year asset lifespans and 20-year investment cycles. So transitioning to low carbon technologies could result in closing plants before the end of their useful life, which would lead to stranded assets. For certain stakeholders, such as investors and lenders, the carbon that is tied up in the production of steel is quickly being recognized as a hotspot in their overall portfolios, and it could pose a risk from a valuation standpoint when you think about things like carbon pricing. And actually, there was a recent study that found that about 14% of steel companies' potential value is at risk. Not only is this a problem from a valuation standpoint, but we're seeing this wave of net zero commitments across the financial sector. So you might have heard of recent commitments from Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase. By our estimates, there's over 100 financial institutions representing about 30 trillion in assets under management that have now committed to transition their portfolios to net zero by 2050 or sooner, which basically means that they would align their investments with globally recognized climate targets. This is massive. This is larger than the combined GDP of the US and Japan. Despite this momentum toward pledging commitments, there are several barriers that financial institutions face in actually achieving these net zero goals. And there's really a lack of clarity among the financial community about how to support the net zero transition for these harder to abate sectors such as steel. So at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance, we have identified 5 primary challenges that we see for financial institutions. One is there is a lot of uncertainty around what this pathway to zero should be for the sector. So if I'm a bank with a climate commitment and there's a client in the steel sector that's looking to refinance, what would I do? How do I know what companies are on track to decarbonize and which represent a larger climate risk? Second is it's hard to know which metric to use to measure alignment. There's so many different methodologies and metrics out there. Third, there is a lack of decision useful data. This is something that we hear from the financial community all the time, that there's a lack of data. Fourth is the barrier of the first mover challenge. So if I'm a bank, I decide not to lend to one company that's particularly carbon intensive, I might miss out on an opportunity. And meanwhile, that corporate or that firm could go down the street to a different bank to secure a loan from a lender that might not have the same standards. And then the fifth barrier that we've identified is there's a lack of investable products that are climate aligned. And I just saw this article in Environmental Finance that found that fewer than 25% of corporates in the economy today are aligned with 1.5 degree climate target. So at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance at RMI, where I work, we have found that taking a sectoral approach can really help financial institutions overcome these challenges. And this is exactly what we did for the shipping sector through something called the Poseidon Principles. And this is where, as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk about Greek mythology. So this is where the Greek mythology comes in. So through the Poseidon Principles, these major ship lenders, so several large banks, came together. They drafted an agreement called the Poseidon Principles, which is a framework. And really what this does is it allows them to assess and then also disclose whether their ship finance portfolios are in line with climate targets for the sector. So in practice, this means that basically shipping companies disclose their carbon intensity of their vessels. And then the lenders, the banks, use that information to compare the actual carbon intensity to an emissions curve so that they understand how close they are to their target, or conversely, how far away they are. This agreement, which was signed in 2019, now includes 26 leading banks, and it represents about 185 billion in shipping finance. So we're taking the success of that model and we're looking at how we can replicate this real world example of collective action through a climate aligned finance agreement for the steel sector. And we think that this will help overcome the 5 barriers I mentioned and really represents a crucial step forward for the steel industry. There's a few reasons. One is this collective voluntary commitment from banks creates a proactive role for financial institutions. Second, it creates a level playing field for financial institutions and can help overcome that one of those challenges I mentioned of competition. Then third, this collective action creates really clear expectations for the steel sector and helps to inform how banks can partner with their clients to support decarbonization. So how are we doing this? Well, to craft this type of collective action for the steel sector, the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is gathering together some of the largest lenders to the steel sector in a working group. And these are going to be 5 to 6 global banks from various geographic regions that will come together in partnership with some of the largest steel producers to develop and identify an industry-backed emissions reduction pathway for the sector. They'll also work to identify a uniform metric to measure against that trajectory. They'll decide on a governance and reporting framework to ensure that there's access to transparent and comparable data for lenders, providing access to that decision useful data I talked about. And we have the very ambitious goal of launching this agreement at COP26. I will note that this initiative is part of something called the Mission Possible Partnership, MPP. It's an alliance of 12 leading organizations, including RMI, that are focused on really taking some of the world's highest emitting industries and figuring out how we can supercharge the efforts to decarbonize in the decisive decade, so the next 10 years. You might have heard of the Mission Possible platform. Well, this effort of the Mission Possible partnership builds on that by bringing together these 12 organizations and expanding and accelerating work of 7 industry working groups. So in addition to steel and shipping, we're also looking at aluminum, aviation, cement and concrete, chemicals, and trucking. And one other thing I'll say is that this effort's not only multi-sectoral, it's really unique in that it takes a multi-stakeholder approach. So there's several work streams that we're working on across these 7 hard to abate sectors. One work stream on industry, another that engages customers to send a demand signal, another that's looking at policies and engaging governments, and then additionally finance, which is the one that we're working on at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance. So you might be wondering why industry would sign up to this. Like, why would they want lenders to work with them to push for decarbonization? I think there's a few reasons. The sector realizes that the global economy is decarbonizing, and there's growing pressure that's coming at them from various angles. That could be regulatory pressure, civil society, their shareholders and lenders, of course. And also, I think there's growing recognition that there are opportunities for new markets that's made possible by zero carbon steel. And some indications that I've heard is that there's more demand for green steel or low carbon steel than what can be supplied. And I think additionally, industry really welcomes or would welcome clear expectations from their lenders so that they know what's being asked of them. As I mentioned, banks are making climate commitments, but they're not sure how to apply them in practice. So something like a climate aligned finance agreement would provide them with this engagement framework necessary to support their clients. By taking a proactive role in aligning decisions with climate goals, banks will also be able to become what we see as policy shapers rather than takers, and better manage their reputation. And then additionally, just one last point here is that the transition offers new investment opportunities and new instruments, such as something like a sustainability linked loan. And it's projected that for the steel sector, the low carbon transition could require about 80 billion per year through 2050 to capitalize new steel assets and supporting infrastructure. So I recognize the task is certainly difficult, but I think what we're seeing at the Center for Climate Aligned Finance is that signs are really promising and momentum is growing. There's several large banks that have expressed interest in creating a climate aligned finance agreement for steel. So I would just say watch this space in the coming month. In particular, we're going to be making a big announcement around the working group members and our work towards developing this agreement by COP. So thanks so much, Rob and Peter.
Thanks, Lucy. And I guess for the Greek mythology, are we expecting a Hephaestus-themed initiative now, or that's a little too in the weeds of Greek mythology?
Yeah, that one's a little hard to say, but we have toyed around with a few different titles for this. I think, the first big thing that we have to tackle is developing the agreement, and then maybe identifying the name can come next.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I think just to bring up one of the larger challenges, I think, for the industry, and you addressed as the first kind of challenge, the limited alternatives, especially at scale. As I mentioned before, I've worked in the sector a long time, understanding the shipping industry has a lot of challenges with the transition as well, but there are probably, being very general, more options and alternatives or ways for them to start to address and decarbonize shipping fleets and things like that, compared to the technical challenges of getting steel out of iron ore at temperature. So what do you see either some work that you'll be doing, or some of the initiatives that you think you've seen that might come out of it that can help address that technical challenge? Because I think it's a bigger lift even than in shipping or some other, aviation being the other area where, some bigger challenges perhaps.
So I actually think that I don't know that it's easier in shipping either. Like, I think that both sectors would really benefit from hydrogen technology.
which was yesterday's topic, and you mentioned hydrogen and came up for steel specifically in industrial applications. So
yeah, exactly. So both would benefit from the availability of hydrogen, and for steel in particular as a reducing agent, of course. And so I don't know that it's necessarily any easier for steel. I think both sectors in the near term are looking at efficiency improvements, and that's probably the lower hanging fruit for the sector. There is something that's a notable difference between steel and shipping, and that is in the shipping sector, there is the International Maritime Organization. So they have a third-party regulator, whereas the steel sector doesn't. And so the lenders to the shipping sector could work really closely with the IMO to work with their adopted net zero, or not net zero, but their adopted carbon target. And for the steel sector, we don't have that third-party regulator.
That's a very helpful point. And I think, so this is kind of one of the questions that came in from the audience of practices to decarbonize the steel industry. You know, the low hanging fruit, you mentioned efficiency, hydrogen is there. Is there anything else that you've seen or has come up in the working groups? Because I can agree that one of the things that you don't think about, or you get a lot of press, BlackRock is saying they're going, you know, net zero, but they still own all these coal assets. Steel doesn't come up in that conversation now, but it's probably not far away. So anything else on the efficiency or some other things that you've heard besides hydrogen or some of the other low-hanging fruit that are interesting or on your radar?
Yeah, so in terms of, I'm getting it. Sorry. In terms of technologies, I mean, I talked about the blast furnace in my keynote, but there is another technology for producing steel, that's the electric arc furnace. And depending on the steel producer's proximity to renewables potential, you could use renewable energy for the electric arc furnace. So that's one option. There's also opportunities for carbon capture and sequestration. So hydrogen and CCS or CCUS are two additional options. And then eventually there's the technology of electrolysis. But I think for right now in the near term, I mean, you've identified that quite clearly, Rob, that's a barrier and that's a challenge. And so for the lenders in this working group that are asking their steel companies to transition, there aren't, you know, commercially viable, readily available technologies that they can just quickly shift to right now, today. So that's part of the reason why we think it's really important for lenders to support their clients as they work towards this decarbonization journey.
That's very helpful. We have a couple minutes left. I assume you're not making a big announcement at the Wall Street Green Summit about what's coming together, since you're saving it for the UN. I can't imagine why. But anything else that you've seen or that you're working on that's really got you optimistic, because this is a big problem and it's a heavy lift, right? And you mentioned it's 8% of the carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, and it's one that it can be a tougher nut to crack. So anything else that you've seen? Obviously, you're working on this project, so you've got to be optimistic about addressing it. But some other things that are making you feel like we're making progress, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that one of the things that I mentioned with the Mission Possible partnership is this multi-stakeholder approach. And so engaging lenders or financial institutions is only one avenue or strategy. We're also seeing that there is a lot of demand for green steel. I think that's something that industry needs to know, is that they can identify a demand signal. So not only are they hearing this from their shareholders and lenders, but they're also hearing from customers that if they build it, they will come, you know. And so there is strong indication of interest for green steel from the automotive sector, also from the construction sector, because as they work to decarbonize some of their largest portion of the carbon footprint in something like the construction industry, the embodied carbon in a lot of their materials is becoming a hot spot in terms of their carbon footprint. And so there is interest in finding ways to decarbonize steel. So I think that there is a lot of momentum from customers and from demand. And then additionally, I would say it is just really promising hearing from some large financial institutions that there is interest in this. Typically, I think for financial institutions, they think about coal, they think about oil and gas, but they're starting to also realize and recognize that these hard to abate sectors that are really reliant on fossil fuels are also increasingly a problem for them in achieving their net zero targets. And so there's a lot of momentum that we're seeing from financial institutions to move in this direction.